I know I'm just an old guy spinning tales, but some tales aren't meant to be ignored. Trust me, you'll want to hear this one. So turn down the lights, settle in, and let's dive into today's chilling stories. Before we begin, a fair warning. What you're about to hear is purely for entertainment. These stories and theories, they're nothing more than shadows in the dark. No proof, just whispers carried by the night. Listen closely, but don't say, "I didn't warn you." Viewer discretion is strongly advised. It's been 5 years since COVID-19 changed the world. People had learned to adapt to a new normal. Masks were now a thing of the past, vaccination drives had succeeded, and the once chaotic streets buzzed with life again. The fear of the virus was fading, replaced by the cautious optimism of a world moving forward. Then came the headlines. At first, it was just a whisper in the media. Unexplained fever cases on the rise in small towns. Most ignored it, thinking it was yet another seasonal flu outbreak. No one thought it could be serious. After all, hadn't they beaten the worst already? Doctors were puzzled. The patients all described the same symptoms: a burning fever, dizziness, and a gnawing sense of dread. But here's where it got strange. Every test for COVID-19, influenza, or any known virus came back negative. Even stranger, the fever didn't show up on medical instruments. No elevated temperature, no physical signs. It was as if the patients only felt like they were burning up, but their bodies remained normal. In one hospital, a young doctor named Rachel noticed something unsettling. "It's like they're afraid of something," she said after speaking to a patient, "but they can't explain what." The patient, a middle-aged man, had clutched her hand tightly before whispering, "It's in the air. Watching, waiting." Rachel laughed it off, assuming he was hallucinating. But later that night, when she checked on him during her rounds, he was gone. There was no sign of struggle. No alarm had gone off. Security footage showed nothing unusual. He had been lying in bed one moment, and the next, the bed was empty. The hospital staff searched everywhere. He hadn't checked out, and no one had seen him leave. It didn't make sense. They called the police, but the officers had no leads. "People don't just vanish," they said, baffled. Word spread quickly. Families of patients began demanding answers. The hospital assured the public it was an isolated incident, just a misunderstanding, perhaps a patient sneaking out. But Rachel knew something wasn't right, and she wasn't the only one. Similar stories began emerging across the country. In small towns, isolated cases of fever were followed by disappearances. Patients described an overwhelming sense of fear before they vanished without a trace. The fever didn't spread like a normal illness. There were no patterns, no clusters, no direct contact. It struck randomly, and when it did, it left nothing behind but empty rooms and unanswered questions. By the end of the week, panic was starting to grow. Social media buzzed with speculation. Some said it was a new COVID variant, one that doctors couldn't detect. Others believed it was something supernatural. A few conspiracy theorists claimed it was a government experiment gone wrong, but most people dismissed it. "Just a media hype," they said. "We've been through worse." Life continued as normal for most. But in the shadows, fear was growing. And for those who had seen it firsthand, the nurses, doctors, and families, it was clear that whatever this was, it wasn't just another pandemic. It was something else, something they didn't understand, something that was just beginning. By the second week, things got worse, much worse. Rachel wasn't sleeping well. After the disappearance of her patient, she had been plagued by recurring nightmares, shadows standing by her bedside, watching her in silence. Every morning she woke up drenched in sweat, the same words from her patient echoing in her mind. It's in the air, watching, waiting. Meanwhile, more disappearances were being reported across the country. What started in small towns was now creeping into major cities. Fever cases were rising, but none of the usual patterns were there. The patients didn't spread it to their families or close contacts. Entire households would suddenly fall sick, only to vanish within a day or two. Despite the rising tension, officials remained hesitant to act. They feared causing another mass panic like in 2020. "We don't have enough evidence to call this a public health emergency," a government spokesperson said during a press conference. "We urge everyone to remain calm." But calm was the last thing anyone felt. In one chilling case, a family of 4 disappeared overnight from their suburban home. Neighbors reported hearing strange whispers in the early hours of the morning. One neighbor, a woman named Julia, said she was woken by what sounded like her own name being called softly from outside her window. "I thought I was dreaming," Julia told reporters, her voice shaking. "But when I looked outside, the street was empty. It was quiet, too quiet." The next morning, she learned that her neighbors were gone. Their car was still in the driveway, their front door locked from the inside. Police found no signs of a break-in, no sign of foul play. Just an empty house, as if the family had simply evaporated. Social media exploded with theories. People posted videos claiming they had captured strange shadows moving outside their homes at night. Some swore they heard voices calling to them in their sleep. Hashtags like the Whisper Plague and Second Wave Mystery began trending worldwide. Despite the growing hysteria, scientists were baffled. How could people vanish without a trace? No virus acted like this. No disease spread in such an erratic, unpredictable manner. Then came the second broadcast. Late one night, every phone, TV, and radio blared a single emergency alert. Stay inside. Avoid looking outside after dark. Do not respond to any voices calling your name. Stay safe. People froze in fear. Unlike the official government press conferences, this message didn't come from any recognizable source. The broadcast ended abruptly, leaving no explanation behind. The fear became palpable. Streets emptied out at night. Windows were covered with thick curtains. People stopped going out, unless absolutely necessary. And still, the fever cases continued to rise. Rachel, desperate for answers, turned to her colleagues for help. "This isn't normal," she said during a late-night meeting with other doctors. "Something else is happening here." One of the older doctors, a man named Dr. Hargrove, leaned forward. His face was pale, and his eyes looked hollow, like he hadn't slept in days. "I've seen something like this before," he whispered, "years ago, in a small village overseas. They didn't call it a virus. They called it a presence." The room fell silent. "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Hargrove hesitated, glancing nervously at the door, as if expecting someone, or something, to walk in at any moment. "They believed it wasn't an illness. They said it was something that lived in fear, something that fed on people's dread. Once it found you, it didn't let go." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying this thing isn't a virus?" Dr. Hargrove gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I don't know what it is, but I know one thing. it's not done yet. That night, Rachel returned home with a growing sense of unease. She locked her doors and windows, turned off all the lights, and sat in silence. Outside, the streets were eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then, just as she was about to go to bed, she heard it. A faint whisper. Her heart stopped. She couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from just outside her window. Slowly, she crept toward the window, her breath hitching in her throat. Every instinct told her not to look, but curiosity got the better of her. She reached for the curtain, hand trembling, and pulled it back ever so slightly. What she saw made her blood run cold. A shadow stood on the empty street, completely still, facing her house. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. Rachel quickly shut the curtain and backed away, her heart pounding. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but before she could dial, the whisper came again, this time louder. And it was calling her name. Rachel didn't sleep that night. Even after the whispering stopped, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside, waiting. Every creak of the house, every shift in the wind outside made her heart race. Her phone sat in her trembling hand, but she didn't call anyone. What would she even say? There's something standing outside my window, but it's not human? By morning, the shadow was gone, but her fear lingered. She knew she couldn't stay silent about this anymore. After a few restless hours of pacing around her apartment, she called Dr. Hargrove. "It was there," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Outside my house. A shadow, like you said. It whispered my name." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You need to leave," Hargrove finally said, his voice urgent. "Go somewhere crowded, somewhere it can't isolate you. And whatever you do, don't listen to it again. If you hear it, ignore it." Rachel was about to ask him what he meant when the line went dead. Meanwhile, across the city, fear was spreading faster than any disease. People began boarding up their windows, sealing every crack and crevice in their homes. Nightfall became something to dread. Everyone knew someone who had disappeared. Neighbors, co-workers, family members. And the pattern was always the same. Fever, whispers, and then nothing. Social media turned into a battleground of panic and theories. Conspiracy theorists claimed that the whispers were the result of government mind control experiments. Others said it was aliens feeding on human fear. Religious groups declared it a divine punishment, urging people to repent. But no one had real answers. The few scientists still trying to investigate the phenomenon were running out of time. Patients with the fever either vanished before they could be studied, or refused to speak, muttering incoherently about voices and shadows. Those who remained unaffected lived in constant terror, waiting for their turn. And then something changed. Late one night, another emergency broadcast appeared on every screen across the country. This time, the message was longer. "This is not a virus. Do not acknowledge the whispers. Do not look outside. If you feel the fever, seek shelter immediately and stay out of sight. We repeat, this is not a virus. Stay inside. Stay silent. Stay safe." Rachel stared at her TV, heart pounding. The words, "This is not a virus," echoed in her mind. What was it then? Something supernatural? Something alien? Or something worse? Something they couldn't even comprehend? Before she could process the message, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Hargrove. "We need to meet. There's something you need to see." Rachel met Hargrove in an abandoned research facility on the outskirts of the city. The building was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Hargrove led her into a small, windowless room where a group of other scientists had gathered around a large screen. "We've been tracking it," Hargrove said, pulling up a series of strange, shifting patterns on the screen. "It's not a virus. It's something different." "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, leaning in closer. "It doesn't spread biologically. It spreads psychologically, through fear. Once you hear the whisper and acknowledge it, you're marked. The fever is just the beginning. The more afraid you become, the stronger its grip on you." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "So, what happens after the fever?" Hargrove hesitated before answering. "You disappear, but not in the way we think. You're taken." "Taken where?" "That's what we don't know," he admitted. "But we've detected strange energy spikes in areas where disappearances occur, almost like a dimensional shift." Rachel's mind reeled. A dimensional shift? Was this some kind of otherworldly force? An entity feeding on human fear, dragging its victims into another realm? Before she could ask more questions, an alarm blared through the facility. "They've found us," Hargrove whispered, his face pale. "We need to go. Now." Rachel and the others fled through the dark hallways of the facility, the alarm ringing in their ears. As they reached the exit, the whisper started, faint at first, then growing louder. Rachel froze. The whispers were calling her name again, soft but insistent. "Don't listen!" Hargrove shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. "Ignore it, or you're next." They burst out into the night, running toward Hargrove's car. The whispers didn't stop. Shadows flickered in the corners of Rachel's vision, moving unnaturally fast, always staying just out of sight. As they drove away, Rachel looked back at the facility. For a brief moment, she saw something standing on the rooftop. A tall, shadowy figure, completely still, watching them as they sped into the distance. Rachel couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure standing on the rooftop. It was burned into her mind, a haunting reminder that whatever they were dealing with wasn't human. The car ride was tense and silent. Hargrove gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the road nervously, as if expecting something to appear out of thin air. They finally stopped at a remote safe house deep in the woods. It looked like an old cabin, far from the city and completely isolated. Hargrove assured her it was protected, though he didn't explain how. Inside, Rachel met two more scientists, both pale and exhausted. One of them, a woman named Dr. Elena Park, seemed on edge, pacing back and forth. "We don't have much time," Elena said, barely glancing at Rachel. "They're getting stronger. The more fear spreads, the more powerful they become." Rachel frowned. "Who are they?" Elena exchanged a glance with Hargrove before answering. "We call them collectors. They're not from this world. They're parasites that feed on human fear. The more afraid people become, the easier it is for the collectors to pull them into their realm." Rachel's stomach churned. Pull them into their realm? You mean they're not killing people? "No," Elena said grimly. "They're taking them. We don't know what happens to the victims after that, but we've detected residual energy where disappearances occur. It's like a doorway is briefly opened, and then nothing." "Why now?" Rachel asked, trying to make sense of it. "Why after COVID-19? Hargrove sighed. "Fear has always been a part of humanity, but the pandemic amplified it. COVID-19 made the world vulnerable, isolated, anxious, afraid. The collectors have likely existed for centuries, feeding on small pockets of fear. But during the pandemic, fear became a global constant. That gave them the power to evolve, to reach across dimensions in ways they never could before. Rachel sat down, her mind racing. It was almost too much to believe. An unseen enemy feeding on fear, dragging people into another dimension. But after everything she had witnessed, she knew it was real. "We have a plan," Elena said, breaking the silence. "It's risky, but it's our only chance. We've found a way to track the energy spikes that occur before a disappearance. If we can get close enough during an event, we might be able to disrupt the doorway and stop the collectors." "Disrupt it how?" Rachel asked. "With this," Elena said, holding up a strange-looking device. It was a small metallic box covered in glowing blue symbols. "It emits a counter-frequency that interferes with the dimensional shift. If we can activate it at the right moment, we might be able to prevent someone from being taken." "Might?" Rachel repeated, her voice rising. "You're not even sure it will work?" Elena gave her a tired look. "We don't have the luxury of certainty. It's either this, or we sit back and let them take more people." Rachel knew they didn't have a choice. If there was even a small chance to stop this nightmare, they had to take it. That night, they received an alert. Another energy spike had been detected in a nearby town. Without wasting time, the team geared up and headed out, bringing the counter-frequency device with them. The town was eerily quiet when they arrived. Most of the houses were dark, the streets deserted. As they approached the source of the energy spike, Rachel felt a familiar chill, the same dread she had felt that night outside her window. "Over there," Hargrove whispered, pointing toward a small house at the end of the street. Faint whispers could be heard emanating from inside, growing louder with each step they took. "Set the device," Elena said urgently. Rachel and Hargrove placed the device on the ground and activated it. The blue symbols began to glow brighter, emitting a low hum that seemed to push back against the whispers. Suddenly, the air around them grew heavy, and the temperature dropped. Shadows began to gather at the edges of the street, moving unnaturally fast. "They're here," Elena said, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Rachel could hear her name being called again, but this time she forced herself to ignore it. She focused on the device, willing it to work. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a blinding flash of blue light, the whispers stopped. The shadows vanished, and the air returned to normal. "It worked," Hargrove said, exhaling in relief. "We stopped it." Rachel felt a wave of hope. Maybe they could fight back after all. Maybe they could stop the collectors before it was too late. But their relief was short-lived. As they packed up the device, Rachel noticed something strange. One of the houses nearby had a message scrawled across its front door in red paint. The letters were uneven, as if written in a hurry. "You can't stop them. They're already inside." Rachel's heart sank. What does that mean? Before anyone could answer, they heard it again, the faint, unmistakable sound of whispers, this time coming from behind them. "They're adapting," Elena said, her face pale. "They're learning how to get around the device." Hargrove grabbed Rachel's arm. "We need to go. Now." As they fled the town, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The collectors weren't just feeding on fear. They were evolving, becoming smarter, more dangerous. And they weren't done yet. Rachel and the team barely made it back to the safe house. The whispers had followed them long after they left the town, lingering in the air like an echo of something ancient and malevolent. The message scrawled on the house, "You can't stop them. They're already inside," played over and over in Rachel's mind. "Inside where?" she asked aloud as they regrouped in the dimly lit room. "Inside people? Inside our world?" No one had an answer. Elena paced anxiously, her hands trembling. If they're adapting, it means the counter-frequency device will stop working soon. We bought ourselves time, but not much. Hargrove leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow. There has to be another way. We've only been reacting to them. What if we could turn the tables? Instead of waiting for them to come, what if we went after them? Rachel frowned. Go after them? How? Hargrove hesitated, then pulled out a worn notebook. Years ago, during a research trip overseas, I heard stories about something similar happening in isolated villages. The locals believed these entities could be fought by confronting them where they were strongest, in their own realm. Rachel's eyes widened. You're talking about going into their dimension? Elena shook her head, incredulous. That's suicide. We don't even know if it's possible to get there, let alone survive. We don't have a choice, Hargrove said firmly. If we wait any longer, they'll overrun us. They're learning, growing stronger. Soon, no one will be safe. Crossing over. The team spent the next few days preparing for what felt like an impossible mission. Using the residual energy data from previous disappearances, they pinpointed a location where the dimensional shifts were strongest, a desolate area near the first reported case of the fever. We'll activate the counter-frequency device at full power, Elena explained, her voice tense but determined. It might open a doorway long enough for us to cross over. Once inside, we'll need to find whatever's anchoring them to our world and destroy it. Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. She was a doctor, not a soldier. But after everything she had seen, the shadows, the whispers, the disappearances, she knew this was their only chance. That night, they drove to the location. The air felt different, heavier, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They set up the device, its blue symbols glowing brighter than ever before. Ready? Hargrove asked, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the machine. Rachel nodded, fear gnawing at her insides. Let's do this. Elena activated the device, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening crack, the air around them shimmered and warped, as if reality itself was bending. A doorway appeared, an inky, swirling void that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. Go! Hargrove shouted. Without hesitation, Rachel stepped through. The world on the other side was unlike anything Rachel had ever seen. Shadows stretched endlessly across a vast, barren landscape. The air was cold and thin, and an oppressive silence hung over everything. We're here, Hargrove said, his voice echoing strangely. Stay close. As they moved forward, Rachel noticed figures in the distance, vague, humanoid shapes that flickered like static. The collectors. They didn't move, but Rachel could feel their eyes, if they had eyes, watching her every step. At the center of the landscape stood a towering monolith, its surface covered in pulsating black veins. Elena pointed at it. That must be the anchor. As they approached the monolith, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than ever before. They weren't just calling Rachel's name, they were speaking directly into her mind, showing her images of fear, loss, and pain. Turn back, the whisper said. You cannot stop us. Rachel clenched her fists, refusing to give in to the fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice shaking. Elena pulled out a small device, a modified version of the counter-frequency machine. "We plant this at the base of the monolith and detonate it. The resulting energy burst should sever their connection to our world." "Should," Rachel repeated, her heart pounding. "We don't have time to argue," Hargrove said. "Do it now." Elena placed the device at the base of the monolith and set the timer. "We have 60 seconds. Run." They turned and sprinted back toward the doorway, the whispers growing louder with each step. The collectors began to move, their static-like forms flickering erratically as they closed in. Rachel could feel the fear rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to keep running, focusing on the doorway ahead. "Almost there!" Hargrove shouted. The ground trembled as the timer reached 0. A blinding flash of light erupted behind them, followed by a deafening roar. Rachel dove through the doorway just as the shockwave hit, collapsing onto the ground on the other side. For a moment, everything was silent. When Rachel opened her eyes, she was back in the real world. The doorway was gone, and the air felt normal. The oppressive heaviness was gone, replaced by a quiet stillness. "It worked," Elena said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We did it." Rachel sat up, her heart still racing. "Are they gone?" Hargrove nodded. "For now, but we need to stay vigilant. They've been pushed back, but if fear spreads again, they might find a way to return." Rachel didn't respond. She knew the fight wasn't truly over. The collectors had been stopped, but the world was still fragile, still vulnerable. As they packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Rachel glanced back at the spot where the doorway had been. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a flicker of a shadow, just out of sight. She turned away, forcing herself not to look back again. Because deep down, she knew one thing: they were still watching.